In 1960, Ford Motor Company was bleeding millions and terrified of the future. To save the company, they needed a car that didn't exist and an engine technology that was considered impossible. They had just lost $250 million on a single car, the Edsel. It was one of the most catastrophic financial disasters in corporate history. The company was paralyzed by fear. The executives wanted to play it safe. They wanted to build boring, reliable grocery getters. But in a small, smoke-filled office in Dearborn, Michigan, a young executive named Lee Iacocca saw something the board of directors didn't. He saw a massive wave of young people, the baby boomers, who were about to turn 18, and he knew they didn't want their parents' cars. He had a vision for a car that didn't exist yet, a car that looked fast, felt dangerous, but was affordable enough for a secretary or a mechanic. But there was a problem, a massive engineering problem. Ford didn't have an engine that could make this dream car work. Their V8s were essentially boat anchors, too heavy, too wide, and too old. To build the Mustang, they didn't just need a new design, they needed a mechanical miracle. This is the true story of the gamble that saved Ford, the secret engineering breakthrough that changed Detroit, and the small block V8 that created an American icon. To understand why the Mustang was such a miracle, you have to understand the atmosphere at Ford in the early 1960s. The atmosphere was toxic. Henry Ford II, the grandson of the founder, known as the Deuce, was still reeling from the Edsel failure. The Edsel was supposed to be the car of the future, but it arrived with styling that people mocked and a price tag during a recession. It became a punchline. Because of this, the corporate mandate was simple: no new risk. Ford was building the Falcon. It was a compact car. It was sensible. It was economical. It was also incredibly boring. It was an appliance to get you from point A to point B. But on the streets, things were changing. The Chevrolet Corvair was gaining traction. European sports cars like MGs and Triumphs were showing up in American driveways. They were small, agile, and fun. Lee Iacocca, who was the vice president and general manager of the Ford division, looked at the census data. He realized that by 1970, half the US population would be under the age of 25. Iacocca famously said, "The market is young and the market is hot." He knew these kids didn't want a Falcon. But when he approached Henry Ford II with the idea of a sporty four-seater car, the answer was a hard no. The company had no money for a new platform. Developing a new car from scratch usually took 4 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Iacocca didn't have the time, and he definitely didn't have the budget. So, he formed a secret committee. They met at the Fairlane Inn, away from the prying eyes of the corporate headquarters. They called themselves the Fairlane Committee. Their goal? To figure out how to build a sports car out of the spare parts bin of the Ford Falcon. But knowing the target market was one thing. Building a machine that didn't fall apart under its own weight was another, and the solution they needed didn't exist yet. Here is the physics problem that threatened to kill the Mustang before it was even named. A sports car needs power. In America, power meant a V8 engine. But in 1960, Ford's standard V8 was the Y-block. The Y-block was durable, but it was cast iron and incredibly heavy. If you dropped a Y-block into a lightweight compact car chassis, you ruined the vehicle. The front end would be too heavy. The handling would be terrible. The suspension components, borrowed from the cheap Falcon, would snap under the stress. Chevy had already solved this. In 1955, they introduced the small block Chevy V8. It was light, compact, and powerful. Ford was lagging behind, desperately trying to catch up. Ford needed a V8 that was physically smaller and hundreds of pounds lighter than anything they had produced before. The solution lay in a technique that was revolutionary at the time: thin wall casting. This is where the secret development comes in. At the Ford foundry, engineers were experimenting with a new way to cast engine blocks. Traditionally, engine blocks were cast with thick walls to account for core shift. When you pour molten iron into a mold, the internal sand cores can move slightly. To be safe, engineers made the metal walls thick so the engine wouldn't leak or crack. Thick walls equal heavy engines. But Ford engineers developed a precision molding process using hot box core technology. This used preheated core boxes and a fast-curing resin sand. It meant the cores were rock-hard and dimensionally perfect. They wouldn't move when the iron was poured. Because the cores were stable, the engineers could make the iron walls of the engine block thinner, much thinner. This project was the birth of the Windsor small block. The first iteration was the 221 cubic inch V8, introduced in the Ford Fairlane in 1962. It was a marvel. It weighed roughly 460 pounds. The old Y block it replaced weighed over 600 pounds. That weight difference, that 150 pound savings off the front axle, was the key. It meant you could put a V8 into a small car without destroying the suspension or the handling. Without the thin wall casting technique, the Mustang as we know it would physically not have worked. With the weight problem solved, Iacocca thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. He still had to convince the boss to spend millions on a car he didn't want. Iacocca had the engine technology on the shelf. Now he just needed the car. He went back to Henry Ford II. He pitched the idea again. A sporty car, seating 4 with a floor-mounted shifter and bucket seats. It had to sell for under $2,500. Henry Ford II was skeptical. He gave Iacocca a tiny budget, $40 million. For context, the Edsel had cost $250 million. And he gave him an impossible deadline. The car had to be ready for the 1964 New York World's Fair. That gave the team only 18 months. In the car world, that is the speed of light. The pressure was immense. If the car flopped, Iacocca's career was over. To meet the budget, they had to cheat, not on quality, but on sourcing. The Mustang was, beneath the skin, a Frankenstein monster. The chassis? Modified Falcon. The suspension? Falcon. The instrument cluster? Falcon. The drivetrain? A mix of Falcon and Fairlane. But the skin had to be unique. Iacocca held a design competition among Ford's internal studios. He told them, "I want a car that looks like it's moving when it's standing still." The winning design came from the Ford studio, led by Joe Oros. It had the long hood, the short rear deck, and the aggressive mouth. It looked European, but it had American muscle. But a pretty car is nothing without a soul. And giving this car a soul required one final engineering gamble that pushed the new engine technology to its absolute limit. By 1963, the 221 engine had been bored out to 260 cubic inches. It was producing 164 horsepower. It wasn't a race car engine yet, but it was smooth, it was light, and it had that V8 rumble that Americans loved. The team worked night and day. They were sleeping in the office. They were fighting over inches of legroom. As the deadline approached, they realized they needed even more power to compete with the Pontiac GTO and the Corvette. Just weeks before production, they finalized the next evolution of the Windsor V8. They bored it out again, to 289 cubic inches. Let's pause for a second and look at this engine. The 289 V8. If you are a car enthusiast, that number 289 is sacred. Why was it so special? It was the perfect balance of size and output. It was compact enough to fit between the narrow shock towers of the Mustang, yet strong enough to handle high RPMs. The magic was in the cylinder heads. The wedge-shaped combustion chambers allowed for efficient airflow. The short stroke meant the pistons didn't have to travel far, allowing the engine to rev quickly. This was the secret sauce. The Mustang was light only, about 2,600 pounds. When you dropped a 2,010 horsepower 289 V8 into a 2,600 pound car, you didn't just get a grocery getter. You got a rocket. It created a power-to-weight ratio that embarrassed cars costing twice as much. But there was a specific version of this engine that became the stuff of legend. The K-code, the high-performance 289. It had solid lifters, a higher compression ratio, and a 4-barrel carburetor. It put out 271 horsepower. This engine turned the Mustang from a secretary's car into a legitimate performance machine. The engineering was done. The car was ready. But nobody, not even Lee Iacocca, expected what was about to happen the moment the public saw. The date was April 17, 1964, the New York World's Fair. Ford had bought ad time on all three major TV networks the night before. It was estimated that 29 million people saw the commercials. When the gates opened at the World's Fair, the Ford Pavilion was mobbed, but the real action was at the dealerships. Across America, Ford dealers were besieged. In Chicago, a dealer had to lock the showroom doors because the crowd was so large, he feared for the safety of the staff. In Texas, a man reportedly slept in the car overnight at the dealership until his check cleared the next morning, just so no one else would buy it. They had expected to sell 100,000 cars in the first year. They hit that number in 3 months. By the end of the first year, they had sold 418,000 Mustangs. It was the most successful product launch in automotive history. But why? Why did it work? Was it the styling? Yes. Was it the price? Yes, $2,368. But the real reason for the longevity of the Mustang wasn't the base model with the 6-cylinder engine. It was the V8. People bought the Mustang because it offered the fantasy of power. Even if they bought the base model, they knew that under the hood of the car next to them was the 289 V8. It gave the brand an aura of excitement. And the thin-wall casting technology held up. The engines were bulletproof. They didn't overheat. They didn't crack. They ran for hundreds of thousands of miles. Ford had taken a massive risk on a new manufacturing process, and it paid off in a way that changed the industry. The sales records were shattered, but there was still one major criticism Iacocca couldn't ignore. To truly become a legend, the Mustang had to beat Ferrari. The Mustang was a sales success, but Lee Iacocca wasn't satisfied. He wanted it to be a racing success. He wanted to prove that the Secretary's car label was wrong. He called Carroll Shelby. Shelby was a Texas chicken farmer turned racing legend who had already beaten Ferrari with the AC Cobra. Iacocca asked Shelby, "Can you make this a race car?" Shelby looked at the Mustang and famously called it a mule. He didn't think it had the chassis for racing. But he looked at the engine. That 289 high-performance V8, he knew he could work with that. Shelby took the Mustang, stripped out the rear seats, stiffened the suspension, and tuned that K-code 289 to the absolute limit. The result was the Shelby GT350. This is where the secret V8 truly shined. On the racetrack, the lightweight engine allowed the nose of the car to turn in sharply. It beat the heavier Corvettes on tight circuits. The GT350 won the SCCA-B Production Championship 3 years in a row. This cemented the Mustang's reputation. It wasn't just a pretty face, it was a predator, and the heart of that predator was the small-block Ford V8. The Mustang had conquered the showroom and the racetrack. Now, it had to survive the test of time, and the massive industry shift it had just created. The success of the Mustang and its V8 engine forced the entire industry to change. General Motors had to rush the Camaro into production to compete. Dodge launched the Challenger. The pony car era was born. But the legacy of that secret thin-wall casting project went far beyond the 1960s. That engine architecture, the Windsor small block, was so good that Ford kept building it for nearly 40 years. It powered trucks, sedans, police cars, and boats. It evolved into the legendary 5.0-litre V8 of the 1980s and 90s. If you drive a modern Ford V8 today, the DNA of that original 1962 experiment is still there. The gamble to use a new casting technology to save weight didn't just save the Mustang project, it saved Ford. After the Edsel disaster, Ford needed a win. They got a dynasty. Think about the stakes. If the thin-wall casting had failed, if the engines had cracked, or if they had been too heavy, the Mustang would likely have been a slow, heavy failure. It would have been another Edsel. Iacocca might have been fired in 1964. The pony car wars might never have happened. The American automotive landscape would look completely different today. It all hinged on the metallurgical science of making iron walls thinner without losing strength. So, what is the lesson here? We often look at success stories like the Mustang and think they were inevitable. We think, of course people wanted a cool sports car. But success is rarely about just one big idea. It's about the convergence of constraints. Iacocca had no money. He had no time. He had a heavy, outdated engine inventory. Those constraints forced innovation. They couldn't brute force the problem with money, so they had to solve it with engineering finesse. The secret wasn't a classified government project. The secret was looking at the boring, dirty process of casting iron in a foundry and asking, can we do this better? The engine that built the Mustang wasn't the biggest, and it wasn't the most expensive. It was simply the smartest solution to an impossible problem. Today, the Mustang is the only original pony car that has been in continuous production since 1964. It is an icon of freedom, speed, and American engineering. But the next time you see one rumble past you at a stoplight, don't just look at the horse on the grille. Think about the invisible engineering inside the block, the thin walls of iron that made the legend possible. History remembers the style, but it was the iron heart under the hood that made the Mustang a legend. I want to hear from you. What is your dream classic car configuration? Drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into automotive history, make sure you're subscribed. We have more stories coming about the engineering breakthroughs that shaped our world. Thanks for watching.